Hello and welcome to the Deep State Consciousness Podcast. Today I'm joined by Ronnie Aaronson. Ronnie is a psychotherapist specialising in work with addictions, and she's also the founder of the Swan Project, a charity set up to work with people with addictions in Bristol, and the author of the book Addictions, This Being Human. Ronnie, good morning. Thank you for being here.
Morning.
So a lot of stuff to get into, but I'd love to hear how you became a psychotherapist to start us off.
Right, I think it was almost by accident. I had a teaching job and I was head of a unit for children with learning difficulties. And when I became pregnant with my fourth child, I thought, I'll just do a counselling course. Well, I had time off work and I really took to it. And then I did an MA in psychodynamic counselling. And then we were allowed to have one, I had a placement in a doctor's surgery, and I was allowed to have one long-term client. And it just happened to be somebody with an addiction. And I got really hooked into that. So it happened in that way. And then I thought, I need to know more about this, because I was just working from what I knew from my counselling training rather than any sort of training. And so I offered myself as a volunteer in a drug and alcohol agency. And they said to me, would you like to become a supervisor? I think they were quite impressed that somebody with an MA was going to volunteer for them. So the agreement was that they would pay for me to do the supervision training, and then I would work for them for 2 years without being paid as a supervisor. So I thought, yes, that would be great, because the difficulty with doing any sort of training is actually getting people to practice on. So and then it was through doing that training that I found out about the Sherwood Psychotherapy Training Institute, because that's where I did my supervision training. And they were saying, why don't you do a psychotherapy training? And so it sort of happened by accident, by a series of happy accidents. So that's how I became a psychotherapist.
Okay. Now, I was going to take this interview in the direction of asking you about your approach to working with addiction, how maybe spirituality has influenced that. But when I picked up your book again the other day, I was struck by the story you start off with, the one that actually prompted you to get going and put pen to paper, where you talk about a lady who the police refused to investigate when she was mugged, I think, and the police refused to investigate because they found she had addiction issues, and then they just walked off. And it struck me that I'd never really thought about why your book was called This Being Human. I know it's the start of a poem by Rumi, but central to the book is not just this is the methodology to work with addiction issues. There's a sense that how society dehumanizes the addict, and how the therapeutic process then is a process of rehumanization. Could you speak to that, maybe that story and that wider approach?
Yes, well, the reason why, first of all, why we set up the Swan Project was because when I was working at the drug and alcohol agency, what happened was the government stopped all funding for anybody with an alcohol addiction, and all the money went instead to people with drug addictions. So, and I think the reasoning was partly because of AA, there's AA, and there's lots of help for them, but not so much for drug addicts. And what a girlfriend and I noticed, another girlfriend that was working there, was that the alcohol addicts were getting sidelined. All the treatment was geared for people with drug problems, and the language and everything changed. And actually the two, although it sounds like they'd have a lot in common, actually they don't, in the way that the language is different and the age, there's usually quite an age gap. And so we were both a bit horrified, and so we set up the Swan Project. But realizing how sidelined people were, especially alcohol addicts, came more to the forefront of my mind as I was running the project, because things like I would go and see people in hospital, and sometimes nobody would know where they were, or they would tell me stories of being rough handled by the nursing staff, and saying things like, this is all your own, it's your own fault, this is self-inflicted. And then I just kept hearing stories that clients were telling me about this and that, and I suddenly realized how sidelined and how they're seen as very different from us. And so, because the Swan Project is mainly run by volunteers, when the volunteers started coming in, we started a training program, which the book is based on, that was mainly about showing how actually they're the same as us, that there isn't a difference. So, I suppose that's what, yeah. Did you want me to tell the story about Andrea?
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, because that's what inspired you to actually, I think you've been thinking about writing the book, and then that happened and you said, okay, I'm putting pen to paper. No.
Do you know, I wasn't even thinking about writing a book.
Oh.
But Andrea was a nurse who'd sadly become addicted to heroin. And she'd gone through a lot of treatment to get it down to methadone. And because she'd started using a bit of alcohol, the social services sent her to our agency. And she was such a lovely, lovely woman. And one day she came in late and she had blood coming out of her ear and out of her nose. And we were all rather shocked. And she said she'd been mugged. And that the police had rushed up because it was an area near where she lived, where there are a lot of police around, and they'd come rushing up to check that she was okay, until she said, oh, they've stolen my handbag and my methadone's in it. And then they just turned around and walked away. And I was so angry. In fact, I can still feel it sort of bubbling in me now. I was so angry that I thought, I've got to write a book to explain to people that this isn't, people aren't taking drugs. They're not drinking to get high. They're doing it to self-soothe. And, then it's because it's an addictive substance. The more you use it, the more you need. And so people get hooked, and very soon they're out of control. So the book poured out of me in, I think it was about 3 weeks. And I was working full time, so it was mainly I would wake at 2 o'clock in the morning without fail, and I would just work till 6. And then I'd get ready to go to work. And I actually remember even dozing off with a client, I'm a bit ashamed to say, but I just couldn't stop it coming. And then it took about another 6 weeks to edit it, because it had just come out in a flood of, oh my God, I just can't bear it. And there is one line in the book where when I read the book, I think, oh yes, my anger just sort of slips out. But it doesn't slip out very often, which I'm quite proud of.
No, it is very measured. Yeah. It's
angry I was.
So we'll stay with the societal for a moment, and then I'll ask you more about your approach to directly working with people with addiction issues. So when I read the book, I emailed you afterwards at some point and said, oh, you must have heard of Gabor Mate, okay, the Canadian. I don't think you had at the point, because it's just so similar. But this concept of the othering of the addict, like we want to push them away, and it's acceptable to degrade addicts. The other category of people this happens to is people with obesity. A lot, right? Or sometimes society does it to ethnic groups. Historically, Jews have been the favoured ones. But with the addiction issues, it's almost as if we want to see that divide, because we don't want to see that could be me, okay, that I could lose control in that way. And I thought Gabor Mate's, the insight that really struck me was how there's a kind of very unhealthy relationship set up in society between people whose addiction issues go into substances and people whose addiction issues go into power. And the people who become addicted to power often then attempt to persecute the substance issues. So, I suppose any thoughts on that, really, the othering and societal implications of it. And I suppose also your thoughts on the criminal justice system and whether that's a good model to whether seeing it as a legal problem is a good model to deal with addiction.
Oh, there's a lot in there.
Yeah, I sort of slipped a big one in at the end there, Ronnie.
Yeah. I might have to come back to
We can come back to that actually in a bit, and maybe we could, because it does feel maybe it would be better at the end. Maybe I could ask you about your approach to working with people with addiction issues. So coming from your psychotherapeutic training, also this idea of the rehumanization of the person, and I know you've had certain spiritual influences along the way too. Not quite sure what they are, but we met at a spiritual group, so I know they're.
Yeah.
What's your approach to working?
Yeah. So, well, I'd like to go back to your first question, just an element of your first question first, which was, people become addicted to power, people become addicted to going to the gym, people become addicted to all sorts of things that are socially acceptable. And we don't see that as a problem, and they're not sidelined. But then, I think alcohol particularly is sort of kicked out of the way, and people poo-poo it because so many people fear, I think, underneath that they've got an alcohol problem, which I think there are so many people in our society that do have a problem with alcohol that aren't just admitting it. And so this image of the guy who sleeps on the park bench, with a bottle of vodka under his arm or wrapped in his thick overcoat, sort of gets perpetuated. And actually, it's not like that at all. We've had all sorts of professional bit. I mean, it touches all walks of society, doesn't it? So I suppose I wanted to say that.
Sure, and I totally see that. I also see, I've been lots of times in the pub with men who are quite drunk and the evils of drugs, right? And these addicts who take drugs whilst clearly medicating their own pain of alcohol and not seeing any relationship whatsoever between what we're.
Yeah. And that's another good point, that lots of people only take drugs after they've had quite a lot to drink, and vice versa. Actually, some people, take drugs first to self-soothe, if you like, and then end up drinking. So the two are sort of quite linked, aren't they? Sometimes. Yeah. So I was wondering how spirituality. I mean, I've been meditating for probably 30 years now, so I do have a very sort of spiritual basis to my life. And as you say, we met at a spiritual thing. It has deeply affected my work, but I'm not sure I can say how. I mean, because also I'm a poet now, but I've introduced a lot of poetry into the Swan Project, and we. So when we were running the day program, which was a program where addicts came for. Let me see, I think it was about 3 hours a day. We don't do it anymore. And there was a slot for meditation, a slot for body work, and a slot for poetry. We would always end with quite a spiritual poem, if you like.
Right.
Just as a source of food, and that's what the meditation was too, and also the book. I tried to do a very holistic approach, and then we provided, counselling on top of that. So because I don't think just one thing works.
Right. Yeah.
And I do think that people with addictions have really lost their touch with nature and with spirituality, with all these things that really feed. A lot of us. So it was an attempt. Actually, we did even go for days to Oxford for a whole day of meditation, and we also, when we were funded, we sent people on retreats for silent retreats for a week. And I remember one client coming back and saying, he was out walking on one of these walking meditations at the retreat, and he looked up at the sky, and he said he felt overwhelmed by love, and he felt that that's what he was trying to get into him by using the alcohol. And it really brought tears to my eyes, and it was like sort of, yes, yes, yes.
Okay, so would it be a leap then to talk about addiction as a kind of misplaced spiritual yearning?
I think it's all to do with, as you know from my book, to do with not having had an attuned other. So, mothers, I mean, a lot of people with addictions have had mothers who've been addicted or been depressed or been, have had some sort of disability, whether it be mental or physical. And so the attunement hasn't been there. And I do think, that spirituality is something about finding an attuned other. So I think it's all sort of linked. And I think nature too, I think for me, the trees are attuned others. I can walk in the silence and feel really seen and heard by the trees, which might sound a bit odd, but
not at all. Not on this podcast.
God, nature. It's all a oneness, really, isn't it? It's just yes. We pretend that it's not.
So what kind of shifts do you see as being possible? What did you see in your work as being the changes that could happen for people struggling with these issues? Because I know people with addiction issues can often feel really imprisoned by them. And they might go a period where they feel like they've got it under control and it flares up again. And what did you see as being possible?
Oh, do you know, I could tell you so many wonderful stories of people who, you watch people, or I've watched people in the Swan Project first coming off the substance by whatever means. And then there's a sort of a honeymoon period where everybody feels, my God, this is great, and fantastic. But then it all gets onto an even keel, and some people will then lapse at that point. And sometimes they have to lapse several times before they get to the place where they realize that actually, no, they can't control it, and they might have to give it up forever. But then there's people just find themselves, and it's extraordinary. And at first it's like they don't know how to respond in the world. They don't know how to act in relationships, because they've often missed out huge chunks of their learning that we just sort of take for granted, because a lot of people are addicted at the age of sort of 13, 14, which comes as quite a shock to people, but it's true. And their emotional development therefore has been sort of truncated, if you like, or it's been halted. And so the day program was about sort of almost re-educating people about emotions, about this. I remember one chap coming back saying, after we'd been out for a day, saying, when I got home, I just had to drink coffee after coffee after coffee, he said, because I had this emotion that I couldn't cope with. Right. And then he said, I looked it up online, and it was happiness. That makes you so sad, doesn't it? Does, yeah. He hadn't ever had that high of happiness without a drug. And so it's about sort of getting people used to living life again. And then you see this absolute blossoming, and people, I think I find one of the most rewarding things, because I was adopted, is them getting back in touch with family members who'd written them off. And that's healing those relationships, being welcomed into a family again. And then you find people getting jobs again. And we had one person who'd had a diagnosis of mental health since she was 3, and when she left the Swan Project, she ditched the label, and she now works as a mental health worker. So just wonderful stories, really.
And I wanted to ask you touched upon it there with family. I think there can be this like kind of swelling of positivity when someone with an addiction issue appears to have kicked it into touch, okay? And then there's a relapse. And there can be a lot of shame around the relapse, okay?
Yeah.
And often people who have struggled with addiction for a long time will have frayed their relationships, or maybe
Yeah,
really damage their relationships with family. Sometimes family feel they've been lied to or misled, sometimes, and
yeah.
don't be honest because of the shame associated. Do you feel the therapy has to be systemic in some way to encompass healing those bonds?
I know that that's the general trend and has been for quite a few years now, probably the last 10 years or so. But I actually don't
Okay.
feel that. I think it could be, it could be helpful. I'm not saying let's ditch it and not do it, but I've found that a lot of certainly people at the Swan Project have managed to heal the relationships anyway, from having therapy themselves and finding the right language to approach their relatives with the right attitude. Yeah, I think that's my position on it, really.
Okay.
Just from the evidence that I've seen.
Okay. Oh, good. Um, could you explain the mechanics of the Swan Project? Because I think it's very interesting the way you set up this charity. It's to do with bringing in student therapists, isn't it? To do
Yeah.
so you've essentially set up a charity where people can get low cost therapy
Yes.
in a way that's very sustainable. I think it's a very
Yeah.
interesting structure and system. I don't know if you mapped it from another existing charity, but if you
No,
explain this
no,
one,
no,
it's
no.
very
I
interesting.
mean, we were in a fortunate position. So what happened was we set up the Swan Project, and the funding, Bristol County Council would only fund for 12 sessions of counselling, which is, what is thought to be enough, which is totally ridiculous. And they say that organisations reflect their client group, and if you think about quick fixes, it feels like the government have adopted the quick fix notion. But anyway, we knew that wouldn't work because we'd worked in an alcohol and drug service before. So the only way of getting them therapy for a longer time was really to use students. So we started with one student and just tried it out. And then we quickly went to 4, then 12. And now we've got 60. So they're not all students in training now. A lot of them have actually qualified. We take in about 12 every year and train them. But people love it so much because it's one of the few places that you can do long-term work. And each counsellor has 4 clients. So we're actually seeing over 200 addicts in Bristol. And when I think sometimes the impact that's having on the environment, because, it's like dropping a pebble in a pond and that helps somebody else help somebody, it helps their relationships generally.
Well,
But
200 is
coming
not a
back
small
to
pebble.
the mechanic, so what we do is we do our supervision in groups of 4 so that it's cheaper for the students. So they pay our supervisors, and then the clients pay a fee. It used to be from £1, but now it's had to go up to £5. So from £5 a week to £25 a week. And they can have, in theory, they can have therapy for 2 years. But quite often, if they're still making progress, we had someone who stayed for, I think it was about 8 years, because he was homeless when he started and he was still making progress. So we just, and luckily he had the same therapist all the way through. So as long as people are making progress, and it's so needed at least 2 years, because often it takes a whole year for the client to build up trust with the counsellor.
Right.
Which does sound a long time. And I'm always saying to students, don't worry if they're just talking about shopping lists or what they're doing in the week, because there'll come a point when it'll change, and it always does. Suddenly they'll start talking about what's bothering them, and then the therapy sort of starts there. So it's almost like you have to have a pre-therapy period while people grow up trust. Because if you think about it, if you've had a parent that you couldn't trust, and and then you've become addicted, and really people can't trust you, so you can't trust people. So where's that trust? Where do you get your trust from? And there isn't anywhere really. So it's with the therapist.
No, I think
Yeah.
that's amazing. It's just that 200 is not a small pebble, Ronnie. That's quite a
No.
substantial.
Yeah.
I just had no idea that it was on that scale. I thought it would. You might have a dozen.
Yeah, no.
So
Yeah, we've worked
incredible.
up gradually. I mean, we've been going for about 12 years now. So, yeah,
Yeah,
this year.
that's. I mean, that's. And I just think it's such an innovative model that could be repeated
Do you know, it
anywhere.
could be repeated in every city in the town. And I have written to MPs, even one, I can't remember who it was, that had an addiction, you know, and said, you know, all you need to do is follow this model. It's self-sustaining. We don't have any funding from anyone. But nobody gets back to me and nobody's interested, which is so sad because it could be doing all this work in every, you know, in every city.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's not MPs that will take it forward. Maybe it's independent people of a similar mind.
Well, yes, I've had other people approach me, somebody who wanted to set it up. I can't remember where it was now, but sadly, it's having the building. It's
Mm,
having the building. You know,
mm.
basically, you need, because we do pay rent, but you can't pay rent while you're building up
Yeah.
the model, if you see what I mean. And we had a landlord who said, "Okay, just give me 10% of what you make." So, you know, we were very lucky. But if government just subsidised that for a while, and also now we've got the model, you could start out quite big actually, so they wouldn't have to subsidise it for
Yeah.
so long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's fascinating because it does seem to me there's a fundamental contradiction in the government providing mental health services in that all their incentives seem to be geared the wrong way. So you get this quick
Yeah.
fix approach so often that people
Yeah.
are always complaining about, and everyone seems to know what the problem is,
Yeah.
but it's very hard to address. So
Yeah.
I think it's a wonderful model, and I hope it does
Yeah.
expand.
Yes, and actually, when we had the day program, it was even better. But they, because there was no alcohol for funding, they had to fund us from something called the, I think it was the adult mental health budget or something. And one of our rivals, we actually made a mistake in that we bid for some work, and one of our rival companies realised how much money we were getting from social services and made such a fuss that they had to reduce our funding. And in the end, it was costing us money to be funded. So we had to do a quick rethink of how we could fund it, which was why the client's fee went up a bit. And also the student's supervision fee had to go up. But it's still, you know, it's still cheap for both parties. And
Yeah,
so,
and
yeah,
as you say, look, just with regard to the impact, if you consider the direct impact on the city and wider area
yeah,
of just the people you're directly contacting, but it is that ripple effect then of how
yeah,
their families are different, how their children will grow up differently,
exactly,
and so on and
exactly.
so on and so on,
Yeah,
um, all the way out. You know, so
yeah,
it's rippling through space and time going into the future.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, it's a shame that nobody else has picked up on it. We need some, you know, some funding body really to pick it up and run with it.
okay,
Yeah.
thank you very much for all that. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
Is there anything else I'd like to talk about? Well, it's probably fine. It's probably fine. When we close down, I'll probably think, oh, damn, I should have done
Yeah, you can call me back.
that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's a fascinating conversation. I'm really inspired by what you've set up, and thanks for coming on and tell us about it.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's hope that the blog does something, you know, and
Yeah,
um,
I'll link to certainly the charity below where people can get details of the Swan Project.
yeah, yeah. Oh, that would be great. Yeah. Okay. Well,
Thank you.
thanks very much, Richard.
Thanks.
Okay. Nice talking to you. Bye.